You know what I learned after 34 years of building a company that I sold for over $100 million? The goal in business is not to be better. Better gets compared. Different, on the other hand, gets remembered. And most companies are constantly trying to improve. But at my company, I was constantly fighting to be different. And it started right from the beginning when I started my company. Now, before I started my company, I had noted at a couple companies that I worked at before that what made them better and more successful was because they were different, not necessarily because they were better. And I'll give you a couple examples. I worked at a Popeyes chicken before I started my company. And what I noted there was that their chicken wasn't necessarily better than Kentucky Fried Chicken or some of the other chicken places out there, but it was different. They focused on spicy chicken. And that differentness attracted a huge amount of business to Popeyes. And I noted that. There was another place that I worked at before I started my company. It was called All American Fitness. It was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And this was before the Gold's Gyms and the Planet Fitnesses and all that. They created a fitness place, a fitness company. They had 3 locations in Tulsa, Oklahoma that were big with a lot of equipment, very clean, had a lot of treadmills and a swimming pool, and it was different than the typical gyms that you saw in town. Now they had all the weightlifting equipment and all that, but when you went in there, it was very modern, had a lot of space and a lot of workout equipment. It was very different than the typical gym in Tulsa. And I noted that. And so when I started my company, I was in the sign supply industry. I was working in the sign supply industry. And when I say signs, I'm talking about those signs that you see out in front of businesses or, on vehicle signage, like graphics on vehicles and that sort of thing. And I worked in that industry as in a supply company that supplied the materials to make signs. But I noticed that all the sign supply companies were very similar. And I knew by working at these previous companies that I needed to be different. So I decided to focus my company, my new company, on the vinyl part of the sign supply industry. That was the fastest growing part because the computer was changing that industry and it was utilizing a lot of pressure sensitive vinyl banner materials and other types of vinyl that were being used in that industry. And so I decided to focus on that. Wasn't necessarily because it was better, but I wanted to be different. And here's why it wasn't necessarily better. I mean, my customers could go and buy all of their supplies from a sign company, so a sign supply company, a typical sign supply company. So that was, in a sense, was better than me because I couldn't sell them everything. I was just focused on the vinyl part. But I learned from studying those previous companies that I worked at that you don't have to be better, you need to be different. And that's what I did. I was different. One thing that I learned very quickly to be different, and I did this on purpose and it worked, was I had a lot of products, different products at my company that were geared towards making vinyl-oriented signs. And it wasn't necessarily because those products were overall better. I was focused on being different than the competition and having a lot of supplies that were geared towards that vinyl sign business. And I stood out. And customers noted that we had a lot of different types of vinyl supplies than the typical sign supply company. Another little strategy that I did, amongst many, but this one was very effective, was I noticed that a very small part of our customer base was paying with cash. So I decided to not accept cash. That was going to be different than the competition, but I realized that if I did that, we could probably be more profitable. But when I did it, I took away the ability to pay cash and everything was only on credit card or credit. That pissed off a few customers. They weren't necessarily happy about it. But it made us different. And I knew that for us to have lower prices than everyone else, we were going to have to operate a little differently than everybody else in order to be able to offer lower prices and be profitable. And that was just one of those methods. And it worked. Most of those customers that complained, they did the math in their head and they realized that sacrificing this ability to pay cash paid off by buying from my company because we had lower prices. And for us, we didn't have to carry cash in our facilities. It made it safer. We didn't have to deal with all that depositing cash at banks and all the different things associated with accepting cash. Everything became a lot simpler at our company from an operational standpoint. Another strategy that I did to be different was I purposely created and designed my company and built my company around having more physical facilities and locations around the country than the competition. Now you got to understand that wasn't necessarily better. And here's why. When we were selling everything out of one location, well, you can maintain one inventory. As soon as you start opening up additional locations, it divides that inventory and makes it more difficult to rotate that inventory. And of course, in order to make the same amount of profit, you've got more overhead now, you've got more people. So it's not necessarily better for our company to open more locations. And also for the customer, it's not necessarily better because every time we open a location, we make it more difficult to have as much inventory. But here was the difference that I noticed and why it worked. It made us different. It made us different. And our customers associated, they wanted to buy locally. They wanted that, and they were willing to give up the occasional us not necessarily being in stock. We could get it to them a little later by shipping from another location. But the fact that we had a location in their city made us different than the competition, a lot of the competition. And over time, we built more locations than anyone else in the country. And once again, it wasn't necessarily because it made our company better or it was necessarily better for our customers, but it made us different and it made us memorable. And we grew as a result of that. Even though a company might be able to ship out the same day and get it there almost at the same time by having just one location, we had a little bit difference there. They could not necessarily always get everything at that facility that same day, but the fact that we had a facility and that they could get a lot of their main products there, that was worth that difference. And once again, made us stand out in the minds of our customers. Another strategy I used to be different was I learned that the CEO, the head of the company, commands a lot of attention. Everybody wants to know what the CEO is doing, who the CEO is. The CEO and the owner, in my case, I was both, is important. It's important to customers. And that CEO, founder, owner can be a big seller, a big salesperson for the company. And I decided that I was going to be that salesperson like most CEOs were in our industry, in the sign supply industry, but I was going to make myself different. So I started wearing my cowboy hat. It was recommended to me by one of my mentors, but it worked. And I started talking a little louder and putting my face on catalogs and on email marketing and in social media, of course, and even on our signage. I stood out from all the other CEOs because I was different. And it wasn't necessarily because I was better. I mean, how would anyone know that I was better? Unless they were actually operating in the company. But the fact that I was different and that I stood out, our company was locked into the minds of our customers and our vendors, and of course, employees also. Everyone knew who my company was run by. It's run by Frank Fellers, and I stood out from all the other CEOs because I was different. And once again, not necessarily because I was a better CEO. Now, those are some of the strategies that I used at my company to be different. But what about outside of our company? I think the best example of being different outside of our company is Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A is a franchise chicken place here in the United States. It has many locations. And if you notice, Chick-fil-A is different than the competition. Now, for a long time, Kentucky Fried Chicken was the number one chicken place in the country and in the world. It probably still is. But why is Chick-fil-A so much more successful than Kentucky Fried Chicken? Because from what reports are that Chick-fil-A is doing double the sales and double the profitability of Kentucky Fried Chicken and almost any other franchise, including McDonald's in the country. But they're different. They're focused on the chicken sandwich. That made them different than Kentucky Fried Chicken, and of course makes them different from McDonald's and most every other franchise, including Popeyes. Popeyes Chicken, which I worked at, and I talked to you about earlier. But Chick-fil-A has gone way past what Popeyes did because I think they're more different than Popeyes or Kentucky Fried Chicken. But here's kind of the final example that I think is really big about Chick-fil-A that's clearly different from everybody else, but not better. And that's the fact that they're closed on Sundays. Everyone knows that that's not necessarily better. I mean, I love Chick-fil-A, but man, I hate the fact that they're closed on Sundays. Sometimes I really want a Chick-fil-A chicken sandwich and they're not open. But you know what? That difference makes them stand out in the minds of their customers, reinforces their position. And it has been an effective strategy to separate themselves from all the competition out there. Now listen, when I was a young man, and I'm sure most of you can relate to this, when I was a young man growing up, going to school, high school, college, I didn't want to be different. I hated being different. I thought it was horrible, and I fought it all the time. But building this company over 34 years, I learned that being different can make you a lot of money.